They say blood keeps you young. They whisper it like some dark little secret. But I was there. I worked at Sea-Sedged Castle. I saw what kind of blood Countess Ursabit Bathory craved, and believe me, it wasn't the kind you get from a butcher. People vanish around nobles all the time, you understand, especially back then. A missing stable boy, a scullery maid who runs off, easily explained, but at Sea-Sedged, the disappearances felt different, heavier. Arriving at Sea-Sedged was like stepping into a different world, one choked with shadows even at midday. The castle clawed at the sky, all harsh angles and dark stone, perched on its hill like a bird of prey. It seemed to watch you, you know. Even the wind whistling through the battlements sounded like whispers, carrying tales you didn't want to understand. My horse didn't like it, kept tossing its head, trying to pull back towards the village road. Can't blame it. The whispers started almost immediately. Not loud, never direct, just passed along in the flickering lamplight of the servants' quarters or breathed quickly behind a hand while fetching water. Girls, young girls, mostly peasants from the surrounding villages, brought to the castle for work. Seamstresses, companions, ladies in waiting. They'd arrive with hopeful faces, clutching meager belongings, and then they wouldn't be seen again. Weeks would pass. I didn't see the Countess often, thank God. Mostly just glimpses, sweeping through a hall in her fine dark gowns, pale skin like polished marble, hair black as a raven's wing. She barely acknowledged us servants, looked right through us as if we were furniture. But her eyes, they were unsettling, dark, intelligent, but cold, utterly devoid of warmth. There was a sharpness there, an intensity that made you want to shrink away. Once, I dropped a pail near the entrance as she was passing. The clang echoed terribly. The nights were the worst. Sea-Sedged Castle wasn't a quiet place after dark, not really. Not like a normal house settling down. There were sounds, carried on the drafts that snaked through the stone corridors. Sometimes, usually late, when the wind howled outside, you'd hear things. Muffled sounds, quick and sharp, like a cry cut short. Other times, a longer, drawn-out wail that seemed to be swallowed by the thick walls almost immediately. There was a whole section of the castle, a wing extending towards the older, more dilapidated northern tower that was strictly off-limits. We were told it was structurally unsound, dangerous. But guards were sometimes posted near the entrances, not workmen. And the steward, Fico, a brute of a man, would patrol nearby more often than seemed necessary for simple safety. We were warned, explicitly, never to go near it. The punishment would be severe. One afternoon, I was tasked with clearing out some old refuse near the kitchens, close to the back service entrance that wasn't far from the forbidden wing. Two of the countesses, assistants, Dorothea and Alona, women whose blank expressions always unnerved me, came struggling out carrying heavy sacks. They were stained, the sacks, darkly stained and dripping slightly. They quickly bundled them onto a cart meant for waste. Anna was a kitchen maid, not much older than me. Cheerful girl, considering the place. Always had a bit of bread saved for the stray dogs. We weren't close, exactly, but we'd exchange a word now and then, a shared glance of weary understanding. Then, one morning, she just wasn't there for the breakfast preparations. Her palate was empty, her few things undisturbed. People avoided my eyes when I asked. The head cook mumbled something about her being called away by the Countess for a special task. I couldn't stand it anymore. The silence, the fear, Anna's empty palate. It was eating me alive. I cornered Istvan, one of the older grooms who'd seen more winters than I'd been alive. I asked him, whispering frantically in the dim stables, asked him what really happened to Anna, to the others. His face went grey. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully, eyes darting around the shadowy space. "Foolish boy," he hissed, his voice trembling. "You see nothing, you hear nothing. Fear can make you stupid, but sometimes it makes you reckless." I started watching, listening more closely, sticking to the shadows near the forbidden wing whenever I could make an excuse. One evening, delivering feed near the kitchens, I heard voices from an alcove often used by Fico and the guards, low, urgent tones. They were arguing about cellar keys, about disposal, something about the lower dungeons near the old well. It took me days to work up the courage, fueled by sleepless nights and the phantom echo of screams. One night, during a particularly raucous feast upstairs that kept most guards occupied, I slipped down to the secondary cellar. Heart pounding like a drum against my ribs, I found the loose stone behind the wine rack, just as Fico had described. It scraped horribly as I moved it, revealing a narrow, dark opening smelling of earth and something else. Seeing that room, it shattered something inside me. The rumors, the whispers, Anna. It was all real, worse than I could have ever imagined. The coppery smell wasn't just blood, it was asterisk bathed in. The thought alone made me retch silently in the passage. There was no unseeing it. Istvan was right. Stay, and eventually that room would be my end, or I'd become one of them, numb to the horror. Escape was no longer a maybe. It was the only thing keeping me from screaming, the passage I'd found. Luck, or maybe desperation, gave me cover. A storm broke that night, thunder rattling the castle stones, rain lashing against the walls, masking any sounds I might make. I slipped back through the hidden passage, heart threatening to explode. I didn't go back to the servants' quarters. Instead, I followed the dank tunnel further, praying Ficco's words about the old well were true. It felt endless, twisting and turning in the suffocating dark, the candle threatening to sputter out. Years have passed since that night. Decades even. I ran, didn't stop running until Sea-Sedged was just a dark memory on a distant horizon. I built a life of sorts. Found work, kept my head down, moved from town to town, always looking over my shoulder. You'd think distance and time would dull the edges, wouldn't you? But they don't. Sea-Sedged isn't just a place I escaped from. It's a place I carry inside me. Every time I close my eyes, I see that hallway, smell that coppery air. They say she bathed in blood to preserve her youth, her beauty, a dark vanity. But what if it wasn't just about looking young? What if it was about surviving, transcending? Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I fill a basin with water to wash. And as I look down just for a moment, the reflection staring back isn't mine. It's pale, aristocratic, with dark, cold eyes filled with an ancient, terrifying hunger. Her eyes. It always starts the same way, you know. That little thing you dismiss. For me, it was the narc. It's funny, I inherited this old place out near Black Creek from a great-aunt I barely knew existed. Built back in the 1880s, they said. Solid stone, isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor, perfect for getting away from, well, everything. The first night, bone-tired from unpacking dusty boxes filled with forgotten lives, I heard it. 3 sharp raps on the heavy oak front door. Knock, knock, knock. The next night it happened again. Same time, just before 2. Knock, knock, knock. Exactly the same rhythm, the same insistent force. This time I didn't even bother getting fully dressed. Just grabbed the heavy fireplace poker, you know, just in case, and crept towards the door again. My heart was doing a little drum solo against my ribs. I listened hard before even touching the peephole. Silence. Sleep became difficult after that. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window panes made me jump. I started keeping the fireplace poker by the bed. The third night, I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting. And sure enough, just as the grandfather clock in the downstairs hall began its wheezing chime for 2 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. It was louder this time. Or maybe it just felt louder in the dead silence of the house, magnified by my own fear. During the day, fueled by weak coffee and sheer nerves, I tried to rationalize it. Loose shutter, a particular branch hitting the door in the wind. I spent hours outside, checking everything. Trimmed back the overgrown branches near the porch, secured every loose piece of wood I could find on the ancient shutters, even checked the heavy iron door knocker. It was stiff, barely movable. Nothing explained that precise, deliberate asterisk knock asterisk. 3 times, always 3, and only ever at night. The 4th night, something changed. The knocking came at the usual time. Knock, 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 but then it continued. Knock, 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 a pause just long enough for me to think it was over, and then again. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't stopping. It was repeating endlessly, a steady, implacable rhythm against the wood. I felt sweat break out on my forehead. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't the wind. This was something else, something patient, something relentless. It went on for maybe an hour that night. The constant triple beat. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, knock. It drove me to the edge. I started yelling at the door, demanding who was there, what they wanted. My voice sounded thin and reedy in the cavernous space, swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence between the volleys of knocks. There was no reply, of course, just the knocking. I even considered barricading the door, piling furniture against it. But what good would that do? The next morning, bleary-eyed and frayed, I searched the house for answers. Not for the source of the knocking, I was starting to believe that was outside the realm of the physical, but for clues about the past, about Elara, about the house itself. In the dusty, forgotten library, filled with crumbling books that smelled of decay and time, I found an old leather-bound journal tucked away behind a row of dull historical texts. It was Elara's. Her handwriting was spidery, faint in places, but readable. That night I waited in the front parlor, not by the door, by the wall Elara mentioned in her diary. It was a solid-looking wall, papered in faded floral patterns, separating the parlor from what seemed like a pantry or storage space. I sat in an old armchair, the fireplace poker across my lap, the gas lamp turned low, casting flickering shadows that made the flower pattern seem to writhe. My breath hitched when the clock struck 2. And then, silence. No knocking at the front door. I spent the next day examining that wall. It felt colder than the others. Running my hand over the faded paper, I could feel slight irregularities beneath, almost like inconsistencies in the plasterwork. I tapped on it lightly with my knuckles. Parts sounded hollow, others unnervingly solid. There was no door, no obvious sign it had ever been anything but a wall. But Elara's diary, the feeling. It took hours. The plaster was thick, stubborn. Beneath it, rough-hewn wooden planks, like an older structure hastily walled over. Sweat dripped into my eyes, mingling with the plaster dust. The rhythmic thud of the hammer was the only sound, replacing the memory of the tapping. Thud, 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 almost like an answer. As I worked, a strange, cloying odor started to seep from the opening I was creating. A smell like old bones, damp earth, and something else. Inside that narrow space, sitting upright, or rather, propped upright by the confines of the space itself, was a skeleton. Dressed in the tattered remnants of what looked like late 19th century clothing, a dark waistcoat, a frilled shirt collar now gray with dust and decay. It was crammed in there, knees drawn up slightly. But it was the right hand that made me recoil, bile rising in my throat. The skeletal fingers were curled, resting against the very planks I had just torn away. Poised. I stumbled back from the wall, gagging, dropping the lantern which thankfully didn't extinguish, just cast wild, lurching shadows across the room. My mind raced, trying to piece it together. The knocking. Elara's diary mentioning it started 50 years ago, maybe around the time this person finally died. Or was it just an echo? A psychic imprint left by the sheer terror and desperation of their final moments, forever rapping against their tomb. Who could do this? Wall someone up alive. I couldn't stay in the parlor. I couldn't look at the hole in the wall anymore. I retreated to the kitchen, poured myself another drink with a trembling hand, gulping it down. The silence was deafening. No wind, no creaks, not even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed audible anymore. Just absence. The absence of the knocking that had tormented me, replaced by the ghastly knowledge of its origin. I kept seeing the skeleton's hand, poised against the wood. Decades of silent, desperate appeal. Panic seized me. I backed away from the table, from the walls. I pressed my hands against my own chest, trying to calm my racing heart. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't my heart. It was slower, more deliberate, and it was coming from inside me. No, that wasn't possible. It felt like it was resonating within my own ribcage, vibrating through my bones. The knocking wasn't just in the house anymore. It was asterisk in me asterisk. Had opening that tomb released something. I don't know how far I ran, stumbling through the overgrown path, branches scratching at my face. The rhythmic asterisk thump 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 was my only companion, a metronome counting down my sanity. Finally, I collapsed near the edge of the woods, gasping, shaking uncontrollably. The vibration was still there, deep within my chest, a parasite thrumming against my bones. Was this the curse of the house, the price for disturbing the dead? It started the moment I inherited Blackwood Manor, I think. Not with the key or the dusty furniture, but with the chill that wasn't just from the old stone. They said my great-great-aunt twice removed left it to me, the last of the line. Just a forgotten name on a family tree until then. The place felt expectant, like it had been holding its breath for decades, waiting. That first night, exploring the library, my hand brushed against a section of ornate wooden paneling. The diary belonged to Alina Vance, my ancestor who lived here in the late 1800s. Her handwriting was elegant, looping script that filled page after page. At first, it was just mundane details of Victorian life, managing the house, social visits. But then the tone shifted. It darkened. She wrote about the loss of her young son, Thomas. The grief was palpable, leaping off the page even after more than a century. Then came the entries about the séances. I became obsessed. I barely left the library for days, just reading Alina's words, fueled by stale biscuits and cold tea. Sleep felt like a waste of time. Her descriptions of the séances grew more detailed. The precise arrangement of the room, the specific phrases used, the shared hope and fear. She mentioned storing the implements somewhere safe. It was a compulsion, really. I started searching the house methodically, driven by a curiosity that felt borrowed. In the attic, tucked away under a grimy canvas sheet, I found it. A small, round mahogany table, intricately carved around the edge with symbols I didn't recognize. Beside it, wrapped in decaying silk, was a heart-shaped wooden planchette with a small glass aperture in the center. It looked exactly as Alina had described. Running my fingers over the smooth, cool wood of the planchette sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. It felt charged. That night, I decided to try it. Just once, I told myself, just to see. I set up the small table in the library, mimicking Alina's descriptions precisely. Candles, the specific chair, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight even though it was pitch black outside. I placed my fingertips lightly on the planchette, just as she wrote she and Mrs. Abernathy had done. The silence in the room was immense, pressing in on my ears. I asked, my voice sounding thin and reedy, "Is anyone there? Alina, Thomas." After that first attempt, I should have stopped. The cold spot, the feeling of being watched, it wasn't comforting, it was deeply unnerving. But I went back to the diary instead. Alina's entries took a turn after her initial hopeful sessions. Mrs. Abernathy, the medium, grew fearful and refused to continue. Alina carried on alone. Her writing became jagged, frantic. I tried to find out more about Alina Vance, went to the local archives, dug through brittle newspapers and dusty ledgers. It was strange. There were records of her birth, her marriage, the purchase of Blackwood Manor. But Thomas's death certificate seemed oddly incomplete, and information about Alina herself just stopped after a certain date around 1895. No death record, no record of her selling the house or moving away. She just vanished from all official documentation. Back at the manor, things escalated. It wasn't just feelings anymore. Small objects would be slightly out of place, a book fallen from a shelf overnight, a door creaking open when there was no draft. I started hearing whispers constantly, right at the edge of my hearing. Impossible to make out words, just sibilant sounds that seemed to follow me from room to room. Shadows in the periphery of my vision seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally when I wasn't looking directly at them. Against all reason, fueled by a mixture of terror and an almost morbid fascination I couldn't shake, I tried the séance again. I needed answers. Or maybe some part of me needed the contact, the validation that I wasn't just imagining things. This time, the air crackled almost immediately. The candles flickered violently, threatening to go out. I placed my fingers on the planchette, and before I even asked a question, it jerked beneath my touch. The next day, frantically searching through the diary again for any clue I might have missed, a page I hadn't noticed before came loose from the binding. It must have been stuck to the inside back cover. It wasn't covered in Alina's script. Instead, it held a drawing. Done in rough, hurried charcoal strokes, smudged and unsettling. It depicted a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs bent at odd angles. After finding the drawing, the feeling of being watched became constant, suffocating. I couldn't shake it. It felt like eyes were on me from every dark corner, every reflective surface. I started catching glimpses of movement in mirrors, dark shapes flitting past just out of sight. Sometimes, standing by a window, I'd see a reflection that wasn't quite mine looking back for a split second. Sleep became almost impossible. I found the final entries in Alina's diary. They were barely legible, the handwriting devolved into desperate scratches and blots of ink. She wrote about the entity growing stronger, feeding on her fear, her grief. She said it wasn't just watching anymore. It was influencing her thoughts, showing her things, terrible things. She mentioned it wanting something specific, not just contact, but substance. "It wants a vessel," she wrote, the words barely clinging to the page. It spoke, not Thomas. The drawing, the final entries, something clicked. The attic. Elena had mentioned carrying on the seances alone up there after Mrs. Abernathy fled. I went back, armed with a crowbar from the shed and the portable gaslight. The floorboards near where I found the seance table looked older, slightly warped. I pried one up, then another. Beneath them was just dirt floor, packed hard. But my hand brushed against something solid. I should have run, boarded up the house, burned the diary, never looked back. But I couldn't. It was like being caught in a current, pulled towards a final, dreadful conclusion. I felt an overwhelming compulsion, stronger than my fear, to perform the seance one last time, right there in the attic above the hidden grave. I set up the small table directly over the loose floorboards, lit the candles, placed my shaking fingers on the planchette. The air felt impossibly cold, thick with unseen pressure. My hand reached down, almost against my will, into the shallow grave. My fingers closed around the small, fragile skull. I lifted it into the flickering light, turning it slowly. Dust flaked away, and then I saw it, faintly carved into the ancient bone just below the right temple, almost invisible unless you were truly looking closer. Asterisk. 2 tiny, precise letters. My initials. A.W. Arthur Willowbrook. My name. How? This skeleton was over a century old.